First the 35, now the 50, in an f1.4 lens lineup that's not clinical but filled with character. If this is not as good as the f1.8s, where does that leave us? But if it's a fast 50 with vintage rendering you're after, why not go for the real deal? Today let's decide which of these should be your first or maybe last fast 50 on the Nikon ZF, the standard, the throwback, or the half measure. This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Hello, I'm Jack, scientist by day, street photographer by night, and the image quality of the 50mm f1.8s is what gave me the confidence to switch to Nikon. I thought the f1.8s was the last fast 50 I'd need for Nikon until I tried this vintage AIS nikkor. It gives digital sensors a more film-like glow, although I did try to get this look purely using Lightroom and Photoshop. Spoiler, it's a huge hassle. But not everyone wants to give up autofocus for vintage rendering. So today let's answer 5 questions about the 50 f1.4 to see where it falls on the modern versus vintage continuum. I've also been looking for the best f-mount adapter for AIS lenses on the ZF. It's not the FTZ or the TT Artisan either. 5. Build. The f1.4 versus the f1.8s, almost identical in size and weight, both about 400 grams, but the f1.8s's lens barrel is plastic composite at the front, metal towards the back, whereas the f1.4 is the other way around. Both the f1.4 and f1.8 have metal lens mounts. Both have rear rubber gaskets. The f1.8s has a focus switch and a focus ring. The f1.4 has no focus switch, but an extra control ring that's knurled and reminiscent of old school nikkors. Coupled with the font and embossed metal lettering, it's more vintage than the printed white lettering on the f1.8s. When the camera is off, neither lens rattles. There's no optical stabilizer in either prime. Solid, compact, and well balanced on the ZF, even if they're not as compact as the 40. Both are well built, but neither feel as robust as this 40-year-old AIS nikkor lens. It's all metal and glass, the super clicky aperture ring, a rubberized focus ring, tolerances smoother and tighter than, dare I say, my Leica lenses, but it's not weather sealed. There's no autofocus motors. It's very much a relic of the past. Nikon kept making them as late as 2020, and depending on the serial number, you can get one that's not that old. Sure, you need to add the cost of an adapter, and Nikon's FTZ or FTZ2, both quite expensive. There are tight seals on both the F and Z connections. It's chipped for autofocus f-mount lenses, but for manual lenses, there's no information being passed through electronic signals. You lose aperture control in the camera. There's no green boxes around the eyes or faces of subjects. A dummy unchipped adapter from Earth works just as well for a fraction of the price, but I went with a different option. 4. Bokeh. Even though they look mostly the same on the outside, the thing that separates the f1.4 from the f1.8s is bokeh. Neither is better, it's all entirely subjective, but the f1.8s is rather famous for its close to flat field curvature. The bokeh rendition looks smooth and even across the frame, like a sheet of frosted glass sits behind the subject. It's a nuanced, subtle look, there to accentuate the subject rather than overpower the image. The f1.4 gives a tiny bit more separation, and the bokeh is a little busy. It's not as smooth as the f1.8s, especially around the edges, and a bit of vintage soap bubbly effect, but not too much. I can get good results out of both, but I personally prefer the f1.8s for a cleaner look. If I want vintage swirl, I'd rather adapt vintage glass. I get the fun and haptics of manual focusing, and just look at these results. Vintage soap bubble bokeh swirl, and the reason I went for the AIS 50 f1.2 rather than the f1.4. If you stop down to f2 on the AIS 50 f1.2, the bokeh starts looking jagged with nonagonal edges and even more vintage vibe. All 3 of these 50s have very distinctive bokeh, and the f1.4Z is definitely closer to modern than vintage. TT Artisan do make an M to Z 6-bit chipped adapter that lets you use all the electronic focus assist tools on the ZF, but they don't make an F to Z 6-bit adapter. I emailed my contact at TT Artisan and they have no plans to make one, so the workaround for now is to stack adapters. An F-mount to M-mount adapter on top of the M to Z 6-bit adapter, and voila. All the electronic focus assist tools are now usable for any F-mount lens. But there's a catch. M mount is smaller than Z mount. For this lens in particular, there's a heavy vignette around the corners when you stack these adapters. This doesn't work, but we're getting closer. 3. Sharpness, another hallmark of vintage glass, a low contrast glow or haze. There's not a trace of that in the 50mm f1.8s. Wide open, it's sharp in the center, sharp in the corners, a really modern look, but that's not the case for the f1.4. Center sharpness is okay, not as sharp as the f1.8s. It does have a closer minimum focus distance, 0.37 versus the f1.8's 0.4 meters, but that sharpness quickly drops off when you shoot into the distance. Maybe it's not the best pick for street photography, architecture, or landscapes. If you're shooting people or portraits, you don't need corner-to-corner sharpness, and character lenses can soften up an image in all the right artistic ways, but does the f1.4 have enough character? You can't beat vintage glass for that. The 50mm f1.2 AIS at f1.2 gives a surreal halo to everything. I thought I was missing focus at first, but it's just the ethereal look coming out of the lens. And when paired with black and white, it's the closest I've come to getting that vintage film look without much editing at all. Back to the modern 50 f1.4, where does it sit on the scale for sharpness? What you lose in sharpness, you don't quite gain back in character, so it's not really modern or particularly vintage. It's stuck somewhere in the middle. If you didn't want to waste time bidding on eBay, stressing over lens serial numbers, can you get this vintage look in post? I've got 2 images here, one taken with the 50mm f1.4, one taken with the f1.2 AIS. It's at the same location with similar but not identical composition. I typically only edit in Lightroom, tweak some contrast and colors, but to try to get this look, I might need to use Photoshop. My edit's up on screen, which you can keep track of while I tell you about this video's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is where I learned more advanced Photoshop techniques. It is the largest online learning community for creatives. There's smarter class categories and the ability to quickly find classes by the software you want to learn. I use it to find a 52-minute course on how to retouch portraits using check layers. And this class taught me how to use a zigzag solar curve to check for dust in the photo, which is really common with vintage lenses. Once I finished this course, Skillshare's Learning Path organized a curated collection of Photoshop courses I can try next. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so you can get started today. Thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. And they're done. That's how long it took to get more of that vintage look in post if I shoot on the 50mm f1.4. And look, I even cheated by editing in black and white. I didn't have to fuss with white balance or the tint, just some basic contrast and clarity while round tripping out to Photoshop for the rest. Duplicate the image, apply lens blur to it, then drop the opacity of that layer until I get the look, the right amount of glow in the original layer down below. I think it now looks similar to the f1.2, but still not quite the same. This amount of time to edit a single image multiplied by all the images from a session. It's so much quicker getting the look right in camera with the right vintage AIS nikkor. That glow and the time you save in editing is worth it. Two, aberrations. The S-line badge of the 50 f1.8s means Nikon threw the kitchen sink at its optical qualities. Minimal distortion and vignetting, it's almost apochromatic with respect to how it handles aberrations. It's the best corrector lens in my collection. There's almost no fringing or CA to speak of. It handles flares really well, a gentle dampening across the frame for a beautifully subtle look. The vintage 50 AIS is, of course, riddled with aberrations, not just the vintage glow, also purple and green fringing all through the frame and the highlights, the bubbles, a lot of distortion for a 50, and there's strong vignetting. It is one of the few AIS lenses with an Adobe Lightroom profile though, so where does the f1.4 sit? Modern or vintage? The fringing is pretty bad. Purple fringing flares up anywhere the scene is overexposed, even by a little. It doesn't really go away either if you stop down to f1.8 or f2, so if you want that wide open look, you have to deal with the consequences in post. Coupled with the f1.4's fall off in sharpness closer to infinity, it does have a more vintage vibe, but the distortion and vignetting aren't as pronounced as the AIS f1.2. In terms of the whole package, flaws and all, I think the f1.4 is closer to vintage than it is to modern, but is that enough? 1. focus. The last feature, and perhaps most overhyped feature of modern lenses, is how many autofocus motors a lens has, how blazing fast the autofocus speed is, and look, neither of these 50s are the fastest autofocusing lenses I've used. That award goes, of course, to Sony. Their f1.2 and f1.4 G Masters have all the bells and whistles, the extreme linear motors Sony can throw at them. Nikon's stepping motors on these lenses, it's accurate and fast enough. For street photography, I can just set a wide area AF box and it'll track any subject within it pretty tightly, quite sticky. This is probably the biggest reason to go with the Z mount for autofocus rather than F mount. Which of these three would I pick as my last fast 50? The 50mm f1.8s. Near apochromatic lenses from any other brand cost many times more. It's even cheaper than the f1.4 in some countries, or if you look out for sales or find a good used copy. How clean its visual signature is lets me create whatever look I want in camera or in post. But I have to say that smooth manual focus experience is really hard to beat, especially when AIS lenses are so well made, which is why it's such a shame Nikon's own FTZ adapters can't unlock the full manual focus suite on the ZF. But I cracked it. The answer comes back to Sony. There are quite a few E to Z mount adapters that provide autofocus for Sony lenses on Nikon Z cameras. These adapters, like this one from Neewer, are all super thin and tiny. There's much less chance of vignetting, and stacking an F to E mount adapter, a cheap dummy one, on this E to Z adapter with autofocus lets you activate all the manual focus tools on the ZF. But there are lots of E to Z adapters and lots of F to E adapters, which I'll be testing in exhaustive detail here when it's ready to go. I did spend too much time and money hunting down adapters, but I had a blast. This is my bokeh therapy.